Hi. If you're a BX Basic Expert Dungeons & Dragons player or referee, and you're interested in Shadowdark, this video is about what kind of adjustments to expect as you make that move. I'm a longtime referee of the BX version of Dungeons & Dragons, but I've been heavily running Shadowdark the past couple of years. Now, if you're a player, I'll go over the kind of adjustments for the play style. But if you're a referee, I find the biggest changes are tied into game prep. Most importantly, I'll cover what I perceive as some of the biggest gaps that get dropped between BX and Shadowdark, and which you might want to keep. Hi, my name's John. Welcome to my channel. This is a place I talk about Shadowdark and old school Dungeons & Dragons. Thanks for being here. Okay, let's dive into today's topic with the player side. So the first thing, characters are going to be really familiar in some ways. Shadowdark uses 3d6 down the line. The ability modifiers are a little different. They're more based on 5e, so they go up to +4 instead of +3. Race class has been separated. It's not a big deal. And there's no saving throws. Instead, there's just ability checks when those kind of things come up. The biggest change I find when it comes to the character side is around advancement. In BX D&D, you have these tables so that all 3rd level fighters, all 5th level fighters look the same. In Shadowdark, at levels 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, all characters roll a random talent, and so there could be a wide range of results. My players call it Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. And to give an example, I've been running a game now for about 2 years. The players are over 6th level. One of the fighters keeps getting like strength bonuses and bonuses to attack and is an absolute beatstick in combat. And the other fighter has gotten bonuses to their armor class multiple times. And now that person's like plate mail, shield, armor class over 20, and runs up and always like ties down the big guy. And it's really interesting to see how two similar characters have diverged with the same character class. This does force some improv and some mental flexibility along the way. The biggest change I find for players is around Encumbrance and Light, and these things are really synergistic in the different rule sets. In BX, especially at low levels, the party will usually have lots of retainers. The encumbrance rules are pretty loose. Light is an easy problem to solve, and your group needs to pick up lots of treasure, but that's not a problem because you've got lots of retainers who can carry sacks and things like that. And in Shadowdark, first off, there are no retainers. It's just the players as a tight little nuclear group. The encumbrance rules are tight. Treasure is sparse, but even then, it can be a struggle to find out how to carry it. And light is an existential threat, or darkness, I should say, is an existential threat. And light is extremely important to the characters. If we go a level deeper, so in BX, armor, it doesn't really affect encumbrance. It just determines your movement rate, whether it's 120, 90, or 60. Gear is just sort of hand-waved. If you want to count it, you can just say a backpack is worth 80 coins, but there's no accounting for what's inside. And we've all played with the guy that says, I've got 50 rations and 200 torches in my backpack. Tracking weapons is optional, and the BX rule set is really about managing coin weight for hauling treasure out. And like I said, even that usually isn't a problem because your party's going to have 4 to 6 retainers. In Shadowdark, you track everything. Characters have limited slots, so typically 10, but if your guy's stronger, they might have a few more. And like every torch, ration, or piece of equipment actually becomes a decision point. I'll give you a quick example. If you've got 10 slots, like maybe you're a cleric without a big strength, you're going to have armor, shield, weapon, missile weapon, ammunition. All right, that's 5 slots right there. That's half your encumbrance. And if you're wearing metal armor, like chainmail or plate mail, that takes extra slots because it's heavy and armor matters. you can see very quickly you start getting into a point where you've got to pick and choose what you're carrying. And this carries over into the game's attitudes about light. When you're first and second level in BX, light does matter. Characters have to worry about torches and things like that. But there's a level, I call it the level 3 threshold. Once you get access to continual light, players will do crazy things. In between adventures, they'll cast continual light on all sorts of objects that they'll put in their pockets and pouches and things like that. The gold coin, or copper coin rather, with a continual light spell on it, gets thrown down the hallway like a flare to light the way, or dropped in pits or holes. As a referee, sure, you will evolve and do things like have anti-magic zones or dispel magic, so that light becomes a factor, but that tends to be more of an exception. And this does lend itself to some cool tactical play, where players have continual light on their iron spikes and things like that. They're throwing them around corners like they're a bunch of Rainbow Six mercenaries. But light doesn't create these survival horror moments. Whereas in Shadowdark, there's no dark vision, no infravision. Even BX had infravision. There's absolutely no continual light spells. And even at high level play, and I've run a number of convention games for like 8th level players, light still matters, and the torch timer still creates pressure for those high-level characters. Yes, spellcasters will have access to light spells, but they fail. They inevitably fail every game session. And then the players are worried about their encumbrance and did they bring enough torches and things like that. And so it always becomes a survival horror game. A couple other small adjustments. One is around luck, which is new. Doesn't exist in old school games. It's more of a modern creation. You can get it from clerics blessing you, or a bard or a seer. Luck is a token that you spend to give yourself a reroll. It helps mitigate some randomness. I think of it like a concession to help make a modern game run smoother. And over time, I've gotten used to luck. The other factor is death is not as instantaneous. In BX, you hit 0 hit points, you're just dead. Although my sense is the majority of referees apply some kind of a house rule to it. Maybe you can be saved at -3, -5, -10, something like that. It sort of mimics what Shadowdark has, which is this short stabilization window. And then the other topic is around spellcasting. So spellcasters have access to more spells, and because it's a roll to cast system, if you're successful, you keep the spell and you can do it multiple times, and it really increases the power of spellcasters. The next topic is your attitudes as a player around money and treasure. So money in a Shadowdark game moving from BX, it will stay relevant a lot longer. So in a BX game, 1 gold piece equals 1 experience point. About 80% of your experience is going to come from treasure. And so like the chart says, and I would use a table like this when planning adventures or writing my own adventures. By the time characters are level 3 or 4, they're going to have access to about 30,000 gold pieces or more inside the party. In fact, the Keep on the Borderlands, like the iconic starting adventure, if you were to add up all the treasure in the Caves of Chaos, which sadly I've done, it's over 30,000 gold pieces of value in there, excluding even the magic items and things like that. So in a BX game, gold tends to pile up and stops really being a motivator for the players. Referees either try to drain money or hope that the players at the mid-levels want to go invest in really big stuff to spend money. In Shadowdark, we tend to use a 1/10 the treasure value of what you'd have in BX. And because gear is expensive, you're constantly replenishing consumables like torches and oil and lantern. And players are carousing in between levels. Money tends to stay relevant. So keep that in mind as you become a player in a game like Shadowdark. It's a motivator throughout your character arc. Okay, let's switch gears. Let's talk about the GM side. We're going to start with the big one, a little philosophical. Gygaxian Naturalism. All right, so what is this? It's a term. It was coined by James Malachevsky of the Grognardia blog. I want to say like 2008 or 2009. And the idea is that when you're looking at like old school Dungeons and Dragons, like the original AD&D monster manual, the monster listings include all this extraneous stuff, observations around rarity and habitat and preferred treasure. And then you read the monster listings and like, what's the chance that in the wild, these other things are going to be there with the monsters or in the lair? Treasure charts, all sorts of non-combat stuff. But what it does is it grounds the monster in the fantasy world, almost like a simulation type perspective. Like when the players aren't around, the monsters have their own lives, and these are the kind of things that they do. And James coined the term Gygaxian Naturalism. I think it's gotten legs since then, so there's a chance you guys may have heard that term. But as we think about BX, so even though this wasn't written by Gary Gygax, it was under his watch, the editors doing that work, an element of Gygaxian naturalism persists in the monster entries of the BX game. Let's take a quick look at one. All right, so here's the orc from Basic Expert, and you can see like in the red boxes, it doesn't have all the same entries that are in AD&D, but we see number appearing. The first number is what you might encounter in a dungeon room or as a wandering monster. The second number is the orc lair. We still get treasure types, and every monster type has a preference for what kind of treasure it's going to collect. And then we jump down to the red box and we see this information that's almost sociological. When the orcs are in the lair, what else appears there? There's chieftains, there might be bodyguards, there's a certain amount of female and young orcs. And then even a chance that there could be like ogres and trolls hanging out with the orcs. It really says a lot about the world building. It implies the kind of role orcs have in the world. And now when we take a look at the Shadowdark Orc, what we get is basically just a combat stat block. So all the humanoids are done this way. We get the combat stat block, and they've got some kind of flavorful ability that will show up and influence the combat that the players are in. But none of that implied world building or Gygaxian naturalism stuff appears. Now, why would Shadowdark drop this kind of stuff? Well, I will say, whenever the Western reaches are done, I'll probably reach out to Kelsey, see if she wouldn't mind doing an interview with us. And that would be one of my questions. I can come up with a couple of solutions. One is space. Shadowdark is extremely compact, and a ton is packed into this book. There's not a lot of room for that kind of material. Frequently, that's going to show up in a dedicated monster manual. It could be that she assumes most people are like her. They've got an old school background and they know the tropes. But it also could be that modern players don't necessarily want those same assumptions. For instance, if you're one of these people who's like, in my world, orcs are different. My orcs are bakers. They make chocolate chip cookies. I don't want violent raider orcs on the fringes of society pillaging with their troll minions and their ogre followers, things like that. So that could be a reason for leaving out that implied world building. But if you're like me and you started playing in the 70s and 80s and you kind of love that stuff, I miss it. And so I do tend to bring BX or AD&D stuff along with me when I'm doing Shadowdark prep. And so I think there's a good argument for like persisting with that stuff and continuing to use it as you're designing dungeons and wilderness and things like that. A similar topic has to do with game balance. So Shadowdark does provide some ideas on how to balance encounters and monsters. There's some guidelines on how many levels worth of monsters will be challenging for some level of players. The advice is, do some calibration, but make sure you mix it up. Have some spikes of danger that are really dangerous. Telegraph that danger, but that becomes part of the challenge of the game is your players need to be able to differentiate between fights and encounters that they can win through like feat of arms versus those ones where they've got to be smarter or just avoid the fight entirely. I hear old school people sometimes say, well, old school D&D is not concerned with game balance. We don't worry about it. In fact, old school Dungeons and Dragons is intensely concerned with game balance. Just as an example, take a look at the Skull Mountain cross section. One of the fundamental design principles for old school dungeons, starting in the 70s, moving into the 80s, is that one dungeon level is a monster level. And so you're going to run into first level monsters predominantly on the first level of the dungeon, and second level monsters on the second, third on the third, and so on. It's absolutely fundamental with the verticality of dungeons. It even carries over into horizontal dungeons. If you think about the Caves of Chaos, going back to the Keep on the Borderlands, the ravine is horizontal. The early caves are first level. The mid caves are second level. And those last few caves are third level. So don't let people say that old school gaming is not concerned with game balance. This is a fundamental concern of old school gaming. And part of it is that you want the game to be player driven, to support player agency. And so if the players find a second level staircase early in their exploration and they're feeling fresh and frosty and they want to go down and try their luck on level 2, like they should have the ability to control that level of risk and reward. Now, I will say the wilderness is a different beast. In the wilderness, anything goes because those encounter tables could run into anything. And in old school D&D, they did separate that by saying that wilderness is like for 4th level guys. The wilderness is for 4th level player characters and more experienced. And that's something I think we frequently modify it with modern adventures. Shadowdark, for instance, supports hex crawls for any level of characters, things like that. Just to make the point further, here's sample encounter tables from old school D&D. This is actually from Old School Essentials, but they are direct copies out of the BX book. Just that the BX tables are on separate pages. This is a real convenient way to see everything head to head, where orcs and goblins are level 1 monsters. Hobgoblins and gnolls appear on the 2nd level of a dungeon. Bugbears and ogres appear on the 3rd level of a dungeon. Remember, these are not hard and fast rules, but they are the guidelines. My personal approach is a lot like what the Shadowdark advice is, which is levels, when I build them, are loosely calibrated to a certain level or range of difficulty, but then there's these extremely dangerous spikes that present skill challenges for the players. And another topic is calibrating the difficulty of the monsters by using the right stat blocks. I've covered this in other videos, so we won't go super in depth here, but just as a simple example, we've got the BX Ogre up top, that Shadowdark Ogre below. The BX Ogre, it's 4th level. It can be put to sleep. It does about 5 hit points a round. It attacks only once. The Shadowdark Ogre, it's level 6. It cannot be put to sleep. It attacks twice a round. It's going to average 14 hit points of damage per round. They are not the same. And you see that across the board with Shadowdark monsters. Most of them are a little bit more threatening, a little bit more dangerous. The characters are a little bit more powerful. They've got more magic behind them. So as a referee, you do want to either use the Shadowdark versions of the monsters or go through a conversion algorithm. Listen, there's nothing stopping you from just running them as is. Your players are just going to walk all over the monsters, and what fun is that? Another conversion topic I think about is treasure. Now, there's no issue with the Shadowdark treasure tables. The treasure's meager. Remember, we tend to give 1/10 out. But I do like to dip back into those basic expert treasure tables and use them for inspiration. We used the example of the orc a few minutes ago. The orcs, they collect treasure type D, which means in Old School Essentials or the BX book, there's a whole table on what kind of things monsters collect if their treasure type is D, I would divide them by 10 for Shadowdark purposes. So an orc layer, instead of having 4,000 gold pieces of treasure across the whole layer, then it'd have 400. But this gives me like, I don't know, inspiration for how I go about and populating treasure in the layer. And I've already mentioned how the players will not be collecting those obscene amounts of gold at very low levels. And so you don't have to worry as much about like inventing taxes, hitting them with training costs, wealth penalties, all the other sneaky things old school DMs do to try to like draw money out of the player side of things. And one of the last topics is about dungeon procedures. Shadowdark assumes that you'll use an every turn initiative. I've used that at conventions where we've got Dwarven Forge or maps out and players are moving miniatures, and it's a way to keep things flowing around the table and everyone engaged. I don't like it so much for theater of the mind or the way I play in my home games. So I persist using a simple dungeon procedure that was made back in the BX days. What I've got on the screen here is the old school essentials version. It works really well. I understand it intuitively, but I've added the torch timer to it, primarily just because the torch timer, it does such a good job of creating a little bit of pressure, sometimes springing darkness onto the players and sometimes springing chaos onto the players. And that's it as far as what I think about when making the move from BX to Shadowdark. For the players, things like player skill over character build still matter. You still need that exploration mindset, but retainers are gone. The gear you carry and your light sources are going to matter a lot more. Money will stay meaningful longer in the campaign. You won't be able to pick up as much treasure, and random advancement will trigger some creative thinking and some improv on behalf of the players. For the referees, the mandatory thing I would say is converting monsters to Shadowdark or using the Shadowdark versions so the players don't just walk all over all of your monsters. And for the world building pieces of your game prep, like the monster ecology or those more nuanced treasure tables, I love to keep these old BX style books involved. And like I said, for dungeon crawling, I still keep the procedural thinking in terms of dungeon terms, but I add the torch timer in there. I've made additional thoughts on comparing old school to Shadowdark in this video. If you haven't seen that one, okay. Thanks for watching. I've told you what I do. Let me know what you do down in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.